4:07 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. There is a category of military threat that exists entirely outside the framework that the preceding century of naval warfare established. It does not have a port of call. It does not have a crew. It does not need to surface, to refuel, or to communicate unless its operators choose to communicate with it. It travels at 30 knots at depths exceeding 1,000 meters, below the operational ceiling of every torpedo in the U.S. Navy's inventory, below the practical reach of every ASW helicopter's dipping sonar, below the depth at which most sonobuoys provide useful acoustic returns. It is not a submarine. It is an autonomous underwater vehicle the size of a large torpedo, nuclear-powered, carrying a payload that the Russian Federation has publicly characterized as capable of generating a radioactive tsunami capable of rendering coastal infrastructure unusable for decades. The Poseidon, designated Status 6 in Western intelligence nomenclature, formerly designated 2M39 in Russian service, had been publicly announced by the Russian government in 2018. Its operational deployment had been assessed by U.S. intelligence as probably achieved in 2022, when the submarine Oscar II-class vessel Belgorod had been observed conducting sustained deep dives in the Barents Sea that were inconsistent with standard submarine operations, but consistent with the launch and recovery of a large autonomous vehicle. The Belgorod was a purpose-modified Oscar II. Its torpedo tubes had been replaced with 6 special-purpose launch tubes designed to accommodate exactly the diameter and length of the Poseidon vehicle. At 4:07 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, a passive sonar contact logged by the SOSUS hydrophone array at a node position in the North Atlantic, the specific location of the array classified, the data product available to Naval Station Rota in Spain, and to Submarine Group 2 at Groton, Connecticut, produced an acoustic signature that the array's signal processing software classified as a probable Poseidon propulsion trace. Not a biological, not a surface ship, not a submarine running at depth. A specific acoustic signature that had been entered into the threat library after the Barents Sea test series in 2022, when U.S. passive surveillance assets had obtained sufficient acoustic collection to build a classification template. The classification confidence was 78%. The array's signal processing standard for an alert transmission was 65%. The alert was transmitted to Naval Station Rota and Naval Submarine Medical Research Laboratory at Groton at 4:07 a.m. Both locations forwarded simultaneously to the Chief of Naval Operations Watch Center and to the National Military Command Center. The watch at the National Military Command Center logged the alert at 4:09 a.m., 2 minutes after the SOSUS detection, a processing and routing delay that the subsequent review would characterize as within standard parameters and wholly inadequate for a threat whose transit speed put it closer to the U.S. East Coast by 3.2 nautical miles for every minute of delay. At 30 knots for 95 minutes, the Poseidon had closed 47.5 nautical miles toward the coast between the moment of the first detection and the moment it was non-operational. It had covered nearly half that distance before the Virginia had even reached the contact area. The geometry of the engagement had been defined not by the U.S. response timeline, but by the Poseidon's transit speed against the distances involved. The detection created an immediate operational problem with no established procedural template. The Poseidon was not a ballistic missile. The GMD system at Fort Greely was not relevant. It was not an aircraft. It was not a submarine in any operational sense that existing ASW doctrine covered. It was a 30-knot autonomous vehicle at 1,000 meters depth in the open Atlantic, carrying, in all assessed configurations, either a 2-megaton nuclear warhead or a cobalt-seeded radiological dispersal device designed to contaminate rather than detonate. Its target was assessed through trajectory analysis as a point on the U.S. East Coast, but trajectory analysis against a vehicle that could alter its course autonomously without transmitting was inherently uncertain. The response architecture activated at 4:11 a.m., 4 minutes after detection, was an improvisation built from existing ASW assets applied to a threat category those assets had never been designed to address. There was no Poseidon response plan in the same sense that there was a ballistic missile defense plan, an air defense plan, or an anti-submarine warfare plan for conventional threats. There was a working group output from a 2023 classified study that had assessed the Poseidon as theoretically engageable under specific conditions and had recommended modifications to the MK-48 ADCAP Mod 7's engagement depth parameters. The study's recommendations had been implemented in the most recent software update to the Mod 7 variant. Whether that implementation worked at the depths the Poseidon actually operated was, as of 4:11 a.m., untested outside of simulated engagement parameters. The response architecture's first task was to test those parameters against a live contact in the open Atlantic with a contamination event as the consequence of failure. 3 P-8 Poseidon Maritime Patrol aircraft at Naval Air Station Patuxent River in Maryland were airborne by 4:19 a.m. on converging headings toward the SOSUS contact bearing. Their mission was not intercept. The P-8's MK-54 lightweight torpedo had a maximum depth capability significantly less than the Poseidon's assessed operating depth of 1,000 meters. Their mission was localization, placing enough sonobuoys in the contact area to generate a track precise enough to vector assets that could engage at depth. Those assets were 3 Virginia-class attack submarines that had been operating in the North Atlantic on standard patrol assignments. The nearest, operating 180 nautical miles from the SOSUS contact position, received the alert and vector data at 4:12 a.m. and altered course at maximum speed toward the contact. At 25 knots, the Virginia's maximum sustained speed, it would reach the contact's projected position in approximately 43 minutes. 43 minutes of 30-knot Poseidon transit represented 21.5 nautical miles of additional distance toward the U.S. coast. The second Virginia, 340 nautical miles from the contact, would require 81 minutes at maximum speed. The third, 490 nautical miles away, was assessed as outside the operationally relevant timeline. The engagement problem was specific and had no precedent. The Poseidon at 1,000 meters depth was below the MK-54 lightweight torpedo's certified engagement envelope. It was below the MK-48 ADCAP heavyweight torpedo's optimal engagement depth. The MK-48 was certified to 800 meters, not 1,000 meters, and its acoustic seeker performance degraded significantly in the 800 to 1,000 meter range band. The Poseidon's operating depth had been specifically selected to be below the threshold at which existing U.S. torpedo systems could engage it reliably. There was one option. The MK-48 ADCAP Mod 7, Common Broadband Advanced Sonar System variant, the most current MK-48 configuration, had an extended depth certification that reached 1,000 meters in the most recent program test cycle. The certification was conditional. The torpedo's seeker performance at 1,000 meters against a small, highly maneuvering target was assessed at significantly reduced probability compared to its performance at optimal depth. Against a large, non-maneuvering vehicle the size of the Poseidon, roughly comparable in acoustic cross-section to a small submarine, the seeker performance at 1,000 meters was assessed at 58% per engagement. 58% was not a comfortable number against a vehicle whose payload could contaminate 300 kilometers of eastern seaboard coastline for decades. The Virginia-class submarine that reached the contact area at 5:02 a.m., the one that had been 180 nautical miles from the SOSUS detection at 4:12 a.m., found a tracking problem when it arrived. The Poseidon had altered course. The autonomous vehicle's onboard navigation had registered the sonobuoy pattern that the PATS had laid to its north and northeast, and had executed a pre-programmed evasion maneuver, descending from 1,000 meters to 1,200 meters and altering course 40 degrees southward. The maneuver was not a response to direct detection of the approaching Virginia. It was a programmed response to any sonobuoy signature above a set acoustic threshold within its detection range. The Poseidon had been designed to evade passive acoustic tracking. Its evasion protocols were autonomous. It did not need its operators to tell it to hide. The P-8 Tactical Coordinator, tracking the sonobuoy returns from her display at 5,000 feet above the North Atlantic, identified the course change through the gap in the sonobuoy pattern's returns at 5:09 a.m., 7 minutes after the Virginia had arrived and begun its own passive search. She transmitted the updated bearing and course change assessment to the submarine via the acoustic communications link that could reach the Virginia at depth without requiring it to expose an antenna. The Virginia altered course to intercept the new bearing at 5:11 a.m. Its own passive array acquired an acoustic contact at 5:14 a.m. Not the Poseidon directly, but the cavitation noise signature of the Poseidon's pump jet propulsor at extended range. It was a detection, not a track. A direction without a solution. The subsequent 22 minutes were the most sustained passive sonar tracking sequence the Virginia's crew had executed in its operational history. The Poseidon was quieter at 1,200 meters depth than the Virginia at 200 meters. The Virginia's own noise was a constant liability. The commanding officer ordered a speed reduction to 5 knots, accepting a reduced approach rate in exchange for a quieter acoustic profile that let his hull array hear the Poseidon more clearly against the background noise of the open Atlantic. 5 knots. The Poseidon was doing 30. The geometry was not in the Virginia's favor. The submarine was falling behind the contact even as it tracked it. What it needed was not a pursuit. It needed an intercept geometry, a solution that placed it ahead of the Poseidon's track rather than behind it. Building that solution required knowing the Poseidon's course, speed, and depth with enough precision to calculate where it would be in 40 minutes, not where it was now. The P-8S provided the answer. 3 aircraft, each maintaining a sonobuoy pattern at different azimuths from the estimated contact position, generated a triangulated bearing solution that the Virginia's fire control received via acoustic communications at 5:31 a.m. The solution showed the Poseidon on a course of 247 degrees, west-southwest, consistent with a trajectory aimed at the mid-Atlantic U.S. coast. Speed confirmed at 30 knots. Depth 1,200 meters. The Virginia's commanding officer had his fire control solution at 5:33 a.m. Not a precise solution. The triangulated bearing had an estimated position error of approximately 600 meters in range. Against a vehicle 1.8 meters in diameter. A 600-meter range error against a 58% a seeker probability produced a first-round intercept probability that the fire control officer calculated at 41%. 41%. Against a vehicle whose payload's effects were irreversible. The commanding officer allocated 4 MK-48 ADCAP Mod 7 torpedoes to the engagement, the maximum number that improved the combined intercept probability to an assessed 87% while leaving the Virginia with sufficient remaining weapons to address any follow-on threat. 4 torpedoes, released in a pattern designed to cover the 600-meter range uncertainty with staggered search corridors that maximize the probability that at least one seeker would acquire the Poseidon's acoustic signature. The first MK-48 released at 5:34 a.m., diving immediately to 1,100 meters on a search heading of 247 degrees. The second released 14 seconds later at a slightly offset course. The third and fourth followed at 14-second intervals on flanking headings that bracketed the estimated track. At 5:34 a.m., U.S. Space Command was monitoring a Cosmos series satellite in a low Earth orbit whose ground track covered the North Atlantic contact area. The satellite was assessed as a relay node for the Poseidon's encrypted communications channel, the link through which Russian operators could transmit updated targeting instructions or an abort command to the vehicle. The satellite's transmission activity had spiked at 5:29 a.m., 4 minutes before the Virginia's weapons release, in a pattern that signals intelligence assessed as consistent with a targeting update transmission. The Poseidon had received new instructions 4 minutes before the torpedoes entered the water. The Poseidon executed an evasion maneuver at 5:36 a.m. 2 minutes after the first torpedo entered its search corridor. The vehicle descended to 1,400 meters and altered course 60 degrees to the south. The maneuver was sharper than the pre-programmed evasion response that had occurred at 5:09 a.m. This was a commanded maneuver, reflecting operator awareness that an intercept was in progress. The commanded maneuver took the Poseidon out of the first torpedo's search corridor. The second torpedo, on its flanking heading, was now on a converging bearing with the vehicle's new course. The seeker activated at 5:38 a.m. as the torpedo entered its active search range. It detected an acoustic return consistent with the Poseidon's propulsion signature at 1,380 meters depth. The seeker locked. The MK-48's certified performance at 1,380 meters was below its nominal specification. The depth exceeded its rated engagement envelope by 380 meters. The seeker was operating outside its certification boundary. The acoustic return was strong enough to maintain lock, but the guidance algorithm's confidence in the track quality was rated at 61% by the torpedo's onboard processor. The torpedo tracked the acoustic return for 4 minutes and 17 seconds before achieving proximity parameters at 5:42 a.m. The warhead functioned. The acoustic signature of the detonation was registered by the SOSUS array, by all 3 P8S sonobuoy patterns, and by the Virginia's hull array simultaneously. The signature was characterized by 2 separate events: the initial detonation at 1,380 meters depth, followed 0.8 seconds later by a secondary event consistent with the catastrophic failure of a nuclear reactor vessel under the detonation's pressure wave. The secondary event was the most significant detail. A nuclear reactor failing catastrophically at 1,380 meters depth in the open Atlantic produced a different acoustic signature than a simple pressure vessel failure. The signature was logged, classified, and transmitted up the chain within 60 seconds of detection. The nuclear warhead on the Poseidon had not detonated. Post-engagement analysis would assess the warhead's condition for weeks. The working assessment at 5:43 a.m. was that the warhead had not reached its arming parameters. The Poseidon's arming sequence required a specific time and depth confirmation that the vehicle had been running for approximately 4 hours at this point, and whether the arming sequence had completed was the question that the classified post-engagement analysis would attempt to answer from the reactor vessel signature data. The Poseidon was non-operational at 5:42 a.m. The warhead's status was unknown. The contamination assessment for the reactor's contents at 1,380 meters depth in the open North Atlantic was immediately elevated to a Priority 1 environmental and strategic evaluation. The Poseidon's nuclear propulsion system carried an estimated 200 kilograms of reactor fuel in its compact liquid metal-cooled design. The catastrophic failure of the reactor vessel at depth distributed that fuel material into the water column at 1,380 meters, a depth where ocean circulation dynamics would carry the contamination in specific directional patterns that the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration's deep current models could project with reasonable confidence. Those projections were being run at 5:50 a.m. Their preliminary output would be classified and shared with the relevant coastal state governments within 8 hours. The reactor's nuclear fuel, distributed at that depth, was not an immediate public health threat to U.S. coastal populations. The Atlantic Ocean's circulation patterns and the depth of the dispersion point reduced the concentration to levels that oceanographic models assessed as below actionable thresholds at coastal distances. It was not zero. It was not negligible. It was a radiological consequence that would require ongoing monitoring and public communication. The commanding officer of the Virginia transmitted his engagement report at 5:45 a.m. The report was 3 pages. Its operational summary was 1 paragraph. Its technical annex on the MK-48's performance at 1,380 meters depth, 380 meters beyond its rated engagement ceiling, was the longest section. The torpedo had performed outside its certification boundary and had achieved the required effect. Whether that performance could be replicated consistently or whether the engagement had been within the normal variance of a system operating at its limits, was the question that the MK-48 Program Office would spend the next several months answering. The 2nd and 3rd Virginia-class submarines arrived at the contact area at 6:11 a.m. and 6:44 a.m., respectively. There was nothing operational remaining for them to engage. The P-8 pattern was still active, its sonobuoys continuing to provide acoustic coverage of the area. The 3 aircraft would maintain pattern coverage for another 4 hours, while the oceanographic assessment team in Norfolk worked through the reactor contamination dispersion models. Time from first SOSUS detection to Poseidon non-operational, 95 minutes. Platform employed: 1. Poseidon, 2. M39, autonomous nuclear-powered underwater vehicle. Launched from assessed Belgorod-class platform in North Atlantic approaches. Transit speed 30 knots, assessed depth 1,000 to 1,400 meters, course consistent with U.S. East Coast trajectory. Probable payload 2 megaton nuclear device or cobalt-seeded radiological dispersal configuration. Detection: SOSUS passive array, 78% classification confidence at 4:07 a.m. P-8 sonobuoy pattern confirmation at 5:09 a.m. Virginia passive hull array contact at 5:14 a.m. Fire control solution at 5:33 a.m. Engagement: 4 MK-48 ADCAP Mod 7 torpedoes released at 5:34 a.m. Second torpedo seeker acquisition at 5:38 a.m. at 1,380 meters depth, 380 meters beyond rated certification ceiling. Detonation confirmed at 5:42 a.m. Secondary event consistent with reactor vessel catastrophic failure logged at 5:42 a.m. plus 0.8 seconds. Poseidon status: non-operational. Warhead status: unknown. Arming sequence completion unconfirmed. Reactor contamination assessment: open Atlantic dispersion at 1,380 meters depth, below immediate coastal actionable threshold, ongoing monitoring required. U.S. assets: no platform losses, no personnel injuries. 3 P-8S and 1 Virginia expended significant operational capacity. MK-48 ready load on engaging Virginia reduced by 4 weapons. Reactor contamination monitoring operation initiated. The Russian Federation's most advanced strategic deterrent delivery system, a vehicle that had been specifically designed to operate below every engagement threshold in the existing USASW architecture, had been tracked by a passive acoustic array from 78% classification confidence, localized by 3 aircraft in coordinated sonobuoy patterns, handed off to a Virginia-class submarine that had built a fire control solution in 19 minutes while operating at 5 knots to reduce its own acoustic noise, and engaged at 380 meters beyond the torpedo's rated certification boundary by a weapon that the program office had not certified for that depth and that had performed within the requirement anyway. 95 minutes. From a detection threshold of 78% confidence in an open ocean acoustic environment to a confirmed non-operational vehicle at 1,380 meters depth. The system had worked. Outside its certification boundary, against a platform specifically designed to defeat it, it had worked. The Torpedo Program Office's 58% per engagement assessment at 1,000 meters had been the number that drove the allocation of 4 weapons. The second weapon had done it. The first 3 had not been needed. The fourth had not been needed. The radiological assessment team in Norfolk opened its first model run at 6 a.m. The SOSUS array continued recording. The P-8S continued their pattern. The Atlantic was still cold and deep and full of acoustic noise. The watch continued.